here done Momentwork or heard of Momentwork? Cool, awesome. The super cool thing about Momentwork is that it allows for what we call an egalitarian process of creating theater, which we'll get more into later, but it also makes theater accessible. You know, you can sort of create a play with a collective of theater artists with what you have at hand. But before that, like I said, I'm really excited to be here, in part because I am Lebanese. My parents came to the United States from Lebanon in the late 1980s, a few years before I was born. And I've been here many times. It's a place I hold very near and dear to my heart. So I thought it only made sense. Do you mind if I stay sitting? Is that okay with everyone? If I see people nodding off, I'll stand up. I'll start dancing. So I thought it was only fit that I started with a story about my mom. So growing up, me, my brother, and all my cousins would always listen to my mom talk about her youth. And she loved to talk about her youth. Specifically, she would brag about how much of a catch she was as a young woman and all the attention she got, right? So she would be chopping the parsley for tabbouleh, giggling like a little girl, talking about all the men who wanted her hand in marriage. And she would proudly exclaim that she could have run for Miss Lebanon if only she was a little taller. And my mom put so much life into these performances, and now she is in her late 50s, and she still tells the same stories as many of us Lebanese people like to do, right? But now her stories have taken on a different life, right? Her voice is a little heavier. She takes longer breaths between the words, and it almost seems like she's longing for the past rather than rejoicing in it. At Tectonic Theater Project, we believe that the way we tell our stories is just as important as the stories we tell. So whether we're recounting anecdotes from our youth or staging a 3-act play about social justice, at Tectonic we're always trying to find new forms to work in the theater. Tectonic has created theater, as Robert mentioned, that has altered national dialogues on issues such as LGBTQ rights, hate crime legislation, as well as the overall role of art in the United States. I firmly believe that in order to understand this work that we've made at Tectonic, it's important to understand the way that we make our work. So a little bit more about the company. Robert mentioned some of this, but it was founded in 1991 by NYU classmates and future husbands, Moises Kaufman and Jeffrey LaHost. Today, Tectonic is mostly known for our devised work. Does everyone know what devised theater is? If not, I was going to offer a definition anyway. So devised theater generally refers to group playmaking, right? So rather than a playwright writing a play and we develop it from there, we sort of collectively create our theater through a variety of methods. At Tectonic, we use Momentwork, but other theater companies might use other methods. So we're predominantly known for the work that we do in devised theater, but when we started out, we were staging existing experimental work by playwrights like Samuel Beckett and Naomi Iizuka, Sophie Treadwell, and many others. And while today, we have performed regionally as well as on and off Broadway, that was not the case at the start. Tectonic started out performing in venues such as church basements, theater lobbies. Yes, you heard me right, the lobbies of the theaters, not the actual theaters themselves. And the back rooms of bars, which I love to hear that because it kind of just goes to show you, when you feel a pull and a need to create art, you do it regardless of the resources at hand. So Tectonic is sort of known for our aesthetic of theater, which is inherently sort of risk-taking. We try and make plays that shy away from realism, that sort of embrace the theatricality and bounds of the stage. Much of this aesthetic is owed in no small part to the background of our artistic director, Moises. He grew up in Caracas, Venezuela, where he grew up going to the Caracas Festival of Theater, which is an international theater festival that brought in such revolutionary artists as Peter Brook and Pina Bausch, Jerzy Grotowski, just artists who were really breaking forms and creating experimental work. So naturally, the theatrical language that Moises grew up speaking was a little more formal than most of us, right? He actually recounts that when he saw his first realistic play in the States, he remembers saying to himself, wow, this play is so avant-garde, there's a couch on stage, and water flows from that faucet, Which is funny because now in the American theater, in many ways, we're sort of obsessed with realism, right? And obsessed with text, even in a day and age when we have things like film and TV that do realism better than theater. So at Tectonic, we're sort of trying to subvert that traditional model. Today at Tectonic, we work in like a laboratory format. We can develop a play anywhere from 1 to 5 years, give or take, using Momentwork. And when we feel like the play is ready for an audience, we have a number of producing partner organizations that we work with. So you heard me mention this guy, but I think he deserves his own slide. So Moises Kaufman is a graduate of NYU in the experimental theater wing. He's an award-winning director, playwright, and an activist in art above all. He's worked with such esteemed names as Jessica Chastain, Robin Williams, Harvey Fierstein, Michael Urie, basically anyone cool and notable, Moises has worked with them. In 2015, he was awarded the National Medal of Art by President Barack Obama, who specifically marked with appreciation how Moises continues to move audiences through his bold portrayals of contemporary social issues. Other accolades listed there. What's so interesting to see is that despite all the commercial success that Moises has achieved, he's still completely dedicated to the devised work that he does with Tectonic, as well as the work that he does as an activist in art. He describes art as a great prism through which we can understand history and current events. Speaking of history and current events, this was the first original play that Tectonic created through Momentwork, Gross Indecency. So in 1895, Irish playwright and poet Oscar Wilde was prosecuted for sodomy and gross indecency with male persons. He served 2 years in prison at hard labor, and his role in society, as well as the role of his art in society as a whole, was completely denounced. He became something of a social outcast in many ways. 100 years later, in 1995, Moises is given a book by a friend called The Wit and Humor of Oscar Wilde, which contained epigrams from Wilde, as well as the transcripts of the 3 trials that he underwent. Moises received this book at a time when the United States Congress had just cut funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, claiming that the NEA was supporting artists whose work was quote-unquote immoral. So a parallel was drawn, right? Moises was hooked, but remember that at this point, Tectonic had only staged existing plays. Mind you, they were staging these existing plays using a rough version of Momentwork, but they had never created an original piece. So he sought the advice of his NYU mentor, Stephen Wong, who suggested that Moises write the play himself. And this is where we start to see the method kind of solidified. Moises rounded a group of actors and designers, and from there, they did what we do in Momentwork today. They started exploring their source material, which ranged from newspaper clippings to scholarly essays, first-hand accounts, biographies. And they explored this with Momentwork and such exercises as, like, each actor would be assigned a character from history that they would do research on, and then you would come to rehearsal and you'd present on your character using the elements of the stage. Gross Indecency premiered at the Greenwich House Theater, where it played for several weeks, starting with a very slow run. I think they said they played for one person once. And then by the end of it, word got out and they were playing sold-out shows and eventually went off-Broadway, where it played an extended sold-out run. And in 1998, it was one of the 10 most produced plays in the United States. So unfortunately, in 1998, that same year, Matthew Shepard, a young gay man from Laramie, Wyoming, was hung to a fence and beaten almost to death, eventually to death, by Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. He didn't die right away. He was left on the fence for 18 hours in October, when he was found, he was brought to the hospital and continued to fight for a few days before he officially died on October 12th. And at this time, between Matthew's beating and his death, the whole eyes of the nation were on the small town of Laramie, Wyoming. I spoke earlier about the inherent need to make art, right? When someone has a need and a pull to make something, they go ahead and do it. I see this the most true with the Laramie Project and Tectonic Project. Moises said, we need to tell this story. We need to go to Laramie and figure out what we can learn from this experience. So Moises, along with Lee Fondakowski, Greg Parati, Andy Paris, Stephen Belber, Barbara Fitzmac-Adams, Maud Mitchell, Sarah Lambert, Michael Emerson, Amanda Gronich, Jeffrey LaHost, Kelly Simpkins, John McAdams, and Stephen Wong. Together, this is the company that made the Laramie Project. So the original company went over to Laramie and started conducting interviews with locals, with friends of Matthew, with friends of the murderers, to kind of figure out what can we learn from this small town. This was in a year in the United States when over 1,000 anti-gay hate crimes were reported. One can only imagine all the crimes that were not reported. So the company kind of wanted to figure out what can we learn from the small town of Laramie, why Laramie? And at this point, they're sort of crafting the method while they make the play. They had experience from Gross Indecency, working with transcripts and found text. Gross Indecency also, it's important to note, gave them the finances that allowed them to go to Laramie. Before Gross Indecency, they were operating with a budget of $0, but then Gross Indecency had a successful off-Broadway run, and they had some money, so they were able to go to Laramie to develop this play. Moises likes to say that it's almost as if Oscar Wilde made it so that Matthew Shepard's story could be told. I'm gonna stand. So the company comes back to New York with hundreds of hours of interview material, and they start exploring the material using, again, a rough version of Momentwork, doing such exercises as introduce your character to the group using an element of the stage, using a costume piece, using lights. Eventually, roles start to become defined, and the Laramie Project premiered at the Denver Center Theater Company in February of 2000. To this day, over 30 million people around the world have seen the Laramie Project. It is one of the most produced plays in the United States every year. Every year, over 100 productions of Laramie happen, either at high schools, colleges, professional, and community theaters. It's also one of the most produced plays in the English language. In 2009, President Barack Obama invited Tectonic to the White House, as Robert mentioned, to witness the signing of legislation that was passed in part due to Laramie and the conversation that it started. It was the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which provided extended resources for state, local, and tribal jurisdictions to effectively investigate and prosecute hate crimes. The Laramie Project also contributed to the formation of the Matthew Shepard Foundation, which does extensive work providing awareness and resources for LGBTQ individuals. I personally saw the effect of Laramie Project a few months back when I went to Tampa, Florida to teach a workshop. The teacher, she was a teacher at a high school, a theater teacher, and she told me that she decided to stage Laramie with her students. And she cited it as something of a risky play to stage in their conservative Tampa, Florida community. She said overall it was a very positive experience for many students and community members, but she said there was still a lot of pushback. Specifically, the character Fred Phelps, Reverend Fred Phelps, who's based on a real conservative reverend. One teacher in particular criticized the students, saying that the Reverend character, who's very homophobic, he said the Reverend character was too intense and not believable. Whereas I've heard from company members that they watered down that character for the play. So the impact of Laramie is still incredibly prevalent today. We live in a day and age when many people believe the best thing that can happen to a play is that it gets made into a movie, right? And Laramie Project was made into a movie, but it also changed the national dialogue on such important issues in the United States as LGBTQ rights, hate crimes, all the way to the national legislative level. It gave a group of artists the tools to become oral historians in a way. So a few more Tectonic Plays. I Am My Own Wife is a collaboration with Doug Wright. It follows the story of Charlotte von Malsdorf, who was a German transgender woman who survived both the Nazi and communist regimes in Germany. She lived in East Berlin. This play was made through Momentwork at Moises' suggestion. It played on Broadway, went on to win the Tony Award for Best Actor and Best Play, as well as the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. 33 Variations tells the story of Ludwig van Beethoven's obsession with Anton Diabelli's waltz. Rumor has it that he criticized Diabelli's waltz as sort of a trite piece of music, but then for some reason he went on to compose 33 variations on the waltz. So this explores his obsession sort of in tandem with the obsession of a fictionalized modern musicologist named Dr. Catherine Brandt. The play went on to play on Broadway, starred Jane Fonda, and was nominated for many Tony Awards and ended up winning for Best Scenic Design of a play. 10 years later, after the death of Matthew Shepard, a smaller group of Tectonic company members decide to go to Laramie to see what has changed. And they were kind of surprised to find that many people were denying that Matthew Shepard's death was a hate crime. You know, they were sort of more concerned with Laramie's reputation as the quote-unquote hate crime capital of the world. So they wanted to sort of see that truth there. And then Laramie Project 10 years later is often performed in conjunction with the original Laramie Project as the Laramie Cycle. A few other plays. One Arm is a staged adaptation of a Tennessee Williams unpublished screenplay. The Tallest Tree in the Forest follows the story of Paul Robeson, who was an athlete, singer, and activist who rose to prominence during the days of legal segregation in the United States. El Gato con Botas is the story of Puss in Boots. Carmen is an adaptation of the classic opera, and Uncommon Sense tells the stories of people living on the autism spectrum. And that premiered recently at the Sheen Center in New York. Tectonic has created and produced over 20 plays since their inception, putting up work at theaters like La Jolla Playhouse, Brooklyn Academy of Music, Kansas City Rep, Berkeley Rep, and many, many others. So, I'm gonna take a drink of water. You've heard me throw around this phrase, moment work, a lot, and you're probably wondering to yourselves, like, what the hell is moment work? So moment work is Tectonic's original method of making theater. It's responsible for making almost all of the plays that we just talked about now. It's a devised theater method, and we refer to it as writing performance, because with moment work gives us a language and a methodology to utilize all the elements of the stage as pathways to creating and maintaining narrative. When I say an element of the stage, I mean basically anything that can communicate from the stage. It can be something traditional like lights or costumes or elements of the stage, elements that we can use to communicate narrative, or it can be something more ethereal, like often we say an element of the stage could be shadow, right? That can tell a story. An element can be humor. Humor tells a story. So moment work allows us to use the elements of the stage to write performance, to create work that is inherently theatrical. When I teach workshops today, actually wait, before I talk about that, so as Robert mentioned, I started working with Tectonic in my senior year of college. I was about to graduate with a degree in theater, and I was being asked to write reflection papers and manifestos on such hard questions as, what do you want to see changed in the American theater, and why do we do theater? And I was embarrassed to kind of find that I didn't really have the answer to any of those things. I didn't really come from a family that went to the theater. I knew that I loved it, and I felt most at home expressing myself through theater. Moment work sort of gave me a language for why we use theater and the power of theater as a medium in and of itself. Now when I teach workshops, I start by asking students to recount a moment of theater that has stuck with them, right? A specific moment that's taken their breath away. And I kid you not, 99% of the time, students are recounting moments that are incredibly theatrical. Rarely does a student talk about text or realism. Often they're moments that incorporate all the elements of the stage. So why in American Western theater are we still sort of obsessed with realism? At Tectonic, that's sort of the question we're asking, and we're trying to subvert the traditional way of making plays. So this is how we make a play in America now, right? A playwright goes into a room, she emerges 10 years later, she has gray hair and a script. From there, she looks to get it produced. A director is hired, a director hires actors. We rehearse for like 2-3 weeks if you're lucky, and then in the very last week, designers are brought in, and all the other elements of the stage are layered on top of text, right? Text is sort of the bedrock of everything. At Tectonic, we sort of want to flip this on its head. We bring all the elements of the stage to the rehearsal room from the very beginning, because we think they can all affect and carry narrative just as well, if not better, than text in a lot of ways. I want to clarify that we don't hate text at Tectonic. Actually, very much the opposite. We're kind of obsessed with story, and our work isn't really that experimental overall. We just are more interested in sort of employing theater for what theater can do, employing work that is inherently theatrical and uses theater of the medium itself. We call this democratizing the theatrical process, because we give agency to all the elements to tell a story. Also, from the very beginning, so when we create with Momentwork, we normally know the roles that people are going to fall into, right? You know that, like, Robert is a playwright, you know, he might eventually write the play, like, this person, Steve, might eventually act in the play. But from the very beginning, roles aren't concretely defined. We're all moment makers from the beginning. We all have a hand in the narrative. And eventually the editor comes into the room, but in the very beginning, we're all sort of crafting together. So this is our fearless leader, Moises, kind of talking about that. So if you can hear him.
I believe that actors are some of the most underutilized artists in America. Actors have this incredible amount of empathetic intelligence. Actors excel at empathy. Actors are trained in empathy. So when a group of people come into a room and begin to try and tell a story theatrically, that kind of empathetic intelligence that actors possess becomes an incredibly useful tool. So what I love about the collaboration of actors in the devising process is that they really profoundly help generate the story that's being told. One of the most interesting things about devising is how it utilizes everybody who's in the room fully. Actors will be asked to act, but they will also be asked to help to the construction of the story. So I think that the devising world uses very holistically all of the different talents of every artist in the room. I think actors today are being taught devising, and one of the exciting things about that is that it encourages actors to think of themselves as storytellers. Actors are important parts of our civil dialogue and important parts of our civil discourse. And that art is perhaps one of the most sophisticated and noble ways in which we as a culture communicate with ourselves. If you empower an actor to think of herself as part of a conversation that's happening in a culture at a given time, then she feels empowered to use her skills, her craft, her intelligence, her talent to participate in a larger conversation.
So he talks predominantly about actors, but the same holds true for all theater practitioners, right? Designers have a hand in the story. Stage managers have a hand in the story. So what it kind of looks like is when we're creating a play with Momentwork, we use a format called I begin, I end, right? So you have your hunch, you have what you're creating a play about, you have your source materials. We normally have huge binders of source materials that we're working with. And you start to create moments using the elements of the stage. So I can get up here, and if I want to make a moment, I say, we use a structure called I begin, I end. So I say I begin, something happens, and that something can be, it can involve lights and sound, people dancing, fire, what have you, I end. Or it can be as simple as I get up here and I do a simple gesture, and that's a moment, right? The idea is that you only see what's between the beginning and ending. And we use these sort of as our building blocks to create our play, right? We name our moments, we keep like a catalog of them, and once you feel like you have enough to work with, you start sequencing and layering moments, sort of seeing what kind of narrative evolves from there. And then at that point, we talk, so up until that point, we don't have the editor in the room. at that point, we bring the editor in the room. With moment work, we normally have 1 or 2 people who make the final decision on things. So once we start sequencing, your director or a supervisor can start playing conductor, right? I saw this firsthand when I worked with Moises on a workshop of a new play that he and Jeffrey are developing called Euphoria, which follows the stories of long-term AIDS survivors. We all brought in our moments, and then Moises sort of works with them, sort of isolating elements. You know, what if we take this element out? What happens? What if we add this element? What happens there? And you can sort of start to craft the play from there. Yeah, so that's sort of moment work in a really brief nutshell. The awesome thing, like I mentioned before, is you don't really need anything to do it. I was talking to Professor Asif before I came, and normally we ask teachers to bring clip lights for lights. And she was like, I don't think I can find clip lights in Lebanon. And I was like, that's fine, like, do you have flashlights? So we work with whatever we have, and the other awesome thing is that everyone has a hand in the narrative. Regardless of the editing process at the end, things get taken out, things get changed, but overall, everyone's fingerprints are on the piece from the beginning. So the Momentwork Institute is sort of our initiative to get moment work to the world. We recently published a book through Penguin Random House. It's something of a manual in our process, moment work. It's written by Moises Kaufman and Barbara Pitts-McAdams, along with Lee Fondakowski, Greg Parati, Andy Paris, Kelly Simpkins, Jimmy Mays, and Scott Barrow. Lori Latham is the director of the Momentwork Institute, and we do residencies, workshops, teacher training labs at a variety of organizations. We do them at high schools, colleges, with professional theaters. They can look as simple as a 60-minute introduction to moment work, or it can be a year-long exploration with Tectonic to devise a full piece, which is what happened my senior year when Tectonic trained us in moment work and led us through the creation of our adaptation of Metamorphosis, which is pictured in that lower left-hand corner. Yeah, and then those are some of our recent teaching partnerships. And of course, we're always creating new work. So what's in the lab right now? Normally Tectonic is developing 5 to 10 plays at a time, but with the recent publishing of the book and the Momentwork Institute, we've been focusing mostly on these 3. So the album recently got a limited premiere in Miami. It follows a photo album documented by Carl Hawker that was delivered to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The photo album depicted a vacation lodge that was on the grounds of Auschwitz. It was a lodge for Nazi officers and high-ranking female secretaries. So we're sort of exploring what can this very strange photo album tell us about the most systematic mass extermination in human history. On a lighter note, The Very Extraordinary Mr. Law tells the story of John Law, who tries to get the members of the court of Versailles to invest in his scheme to turn gold into paper money, and it kind of goes to shit. Euphoria, I mentioned before, it follows the stories of long-term AIDS survivors and the history of ACT UP, which was an activist organization dedicated to providing increased awareness and scientific research during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the United States. It also follows the story of a revolutionary young activist named Spencer Cox, who made incredible scientific advances despite, and activist-related advances despite his limited experience in both fields. Spencer sort of, once the hype surrounding ACT UP sort of died out, Spencer sort of went on a downward spiral, and many consider his death a suicide because he was HIV positive and stopped taking his medicine. So Euphoria sort of explores that world. All of these plays are developed through moment work, currently being developed through moment work, and they all sort of carry forward Tectonic's mission to create theater that is form-breaking and rigorous in many ways, and also theater that is in conversation with the zeitgeist, theater that works to implement social change. And that's all I have.
Thank you.
Great audience. Thank you.
All right, so
that was good.
what we are going to do and what we said we're going to do, maybe we could shed a little light on the situation, is that maybe I will start the conversation and then we'll find a kind of organic moment to bring you into the conversation. But I'll start by saying that I first met Moises in 1997 in New York. At that point, I had just written a play about Lee Atwater, who was George Bush the father's campaign manager, who had in 1988 run what was effectively the most racist campaign of the 20th century. He had made an African-American rapist the centerpiece of the presidential candidacy, and he took George Bush, who was seen as kind of an ineffectual character, into a super tough guy, and also a man of the people, from a kind of a Connecticut Republican and a genteel sort of fellow into somebody who loved stock car racing, pork rinds, country music, and that catapulted him to the presidency. Then Atwater, this campaign manager, who had himself become a rock and roll guitarist, had been one in high school, he knew what he was doing using race in the United States. You see it now with Trump. It's toxic. If you go there, you know, you poison the body politic. So he knew exactly what he was doing, and it worked. But what happened is that he got brain cancer. And before he died, he wrote a long a column in Life magazine in which he apologized. Wasn't quite clear exactly what he apologized for, but it was an acknowledgement that he knew what he had done, because he grew up in the American South, and he understood that if you use race, the consequences read down in all kinds of directions. So I had done that play, and I'd done another play about the Black Panthers, and I had written a couple of pieces for the New York Times, and the editor of the cultural section of the New York Times asked if I'd like to write something about this new play about Oscar Wilde that was downtown in New York. And so I went, and as somebody who wrote theater and went to the theater a lot, and Philipe and I were talking about it before, every once in a while you go to the theater and you think there are only a limited number of things you can do. It's physical world, there are people here, there's light or whatever, and along will come somebody who will do something that is shocking, that just, why have no one else done that before? And you see it, Michael Frayn did it with Copenhagen, a 3-person play that's about physics, right? Subatomic particles. And it works beautifully. It's like a Chekhov play in which the characters are historical characters, Heisenberg, Bohr. The consequences are profound. But this play about Oscar Wilde, I saw it, and you know, you're humbled as somebody who tries to devote your life and a lot of energy to this sort of thing. I went, wow, you know, look at that. And I went back and I went back again, and one of the things that I'm interested in, you know, sort of talking about is the fact that everything, obviously not everything, but the amount of material that ended up in the play. It's a play about Oscar Wilde, who himself is a playwright. He becomes sort of the main character in his own life and causes his own destruction. But the play actually contains the story of how the play is made. Mm-hmm. In other words, characters in the play are like a book. From this book, right? The books are the characters. There are literally 3 trials that Oscar Wilde went through, and one was his own lawsuit, which for some unknown reason he decided to sue his lover's father for calling him a sodomite, and he was. And he kind of knew that he was tempting fate by doing it. And then there's a trial in which he's effectively tried for his literary works, which is astounding. They literally, you know, they would read Dorian Gray. Is this whatever, Dorian Gray? Did you write this, right? And so it brings in this whole literary world and theatrical world. And then you see him actually, his world language began to implode. This man who's nothing but language in the 3rd trial. And it becomes clear that the play is constructing homosexuality. That, being gay or what, this is the moment. And in fact, what is it Queen Victoria says about women, or whatever? It's one of the great jokes in the play. She says, they go, well, what about women? Because the law is, gross indecency between two male persons. Somebody says, what about women? They don't do that, or something like that. There's some, is this construction of sexuality. So there's so many layers to the play. At the same time, you're following the story of Oscar Wilde. It really is a compelling story. It's almost watching a train wreck in slow motion. So it is like a Greek play. So it's true it's not realistic, but it contains that element that's kind of grabs you by the collar, and you got to watch, and what's going to happen next, and what's going to happen next, and yet it has all of these other layers to it. So that seems like a starting point is how much of what happens in this moment process actually ends up on stage. And of course, if you think of the iceberg as the metaphor, there are many metaphors. What do we actually see, or what portion do we actually see above the surface of everything that you're doing backstage in the lab, in the rehearsal room?
Yeah, I think if I were to put a number to it, you're probably seeing 40%, around there. And you make me think a lot about, so when we create with Momentwork, we think about organizing principles, right? And we normally consider two kinds of organizing principles. We have our theatrical organizing principle, as well as our dramatic organizing principle. So an organizing principle, essentially, other theater scholars might refer to it as a central question, right? What is sort of guiding our theater exploration? And with Gross Indecency, it started out as, and often the organizing principles change. So the dramatic organizing principle started out as why was Victorian society so afraid of Oscar Wilde? Is it because he was a homosexual? Was it because his art was radical? Was it because of his rhetoric?
And he's Irish too. That's what I mean. There's so many layers. Of course, he's Irish, and and one kind of forgets this when you study post-colonial theory. You think, oh, India. You think of Nigeria. The Irish showed the way.
Right.
So he's from a decentered perspective on many levels.
Sure, and then the organizing principle, interestingly enough, like you talk about the form of actors holding up the text that they're speaking from. The organizing principle, as Tectonic was excavating, as we do, we go through our source materials in the Momentwork process. We eventually found that all the accounts were sort of disparate, right? Oscar Wilde would recount one moment from the trial, and Lord Alfred Douglas would recount it in a completely different way. So it's sort of, the organizing principle changed to, and the play changed to a play about the impossibility of reconstructing history, right? Then from there, once our subject matter changed, you have to think the way that we tell the story has to change too. So naturally that form, and that's our theatrical organizing principle, right? How are we going to tell the story? And the form of holding up the text, and then eventually that form is sort of dismantled, right? They don't hold up the text, and along with it, Oscar Wilde is sort of breaking down. So I think what you're sort of pointing to is, we're always thinking, how are we going to tell the story, right? What's the form? What's the container that the story is going to take? And then from there, you're always critically analyzing, all right, what's the relationship between form and content? Because we're endlessly fascinated by that conversation between form and content. And I think that's what's happening in Gross Indecency.
No, it's a beautiful way to describe it. Maybe I'll make one comment about the Laramie Project, and then we'll open it up. I recall one of the things that Moises said in my favorite thing that he said in the piece was we talked a long time. I'd never met him, whenever I was like writing about the play, and I was really interested. I was like, wow, it's really exciting as another playwright to go, and it's humbling and exciting or whatever. What's the process? I'm really admiring what you're doing, liking what you're doing. And so it turned out he was telling me about his life in Venezuela. He went to business school. I went, oh, that's interesting. So, and you notice he created institutional structure here with all of these plays. It wasn't a one-shot deal. I said, so, so what do you want me else to say? You're from Venezuela, you went to business school, how do you feel about me talking about your own sexuality, the fact that you're gay, and Oscar Wilde is, and whatever, and he went, you're going to put that in the New York Times? And I went, that's what I'm asking you. We're just kind of walking through it or whatever. And he went, well, I'll need to, tell my father I don't want to come out in the New York Times. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting that you've kind of, the play kind of got ahead. But the other thing that he said that really struck me, and it goes back to what you said, is having grown in Venezuela, and seen a lot of international theater as opposed to Americans tend to have, even if you're in New York, a very insular view of the world, especially with theater. And so having seen Peter Brook and having seen Tadas Kantor and having seen the most innovative theater makers, of course he was preoccupied with form, but the way that he formulated the question was, he said, what can theater do that no other medium can do, right? And it's a huge question in this age of technology, right? Technology can do this and technology can offer that. What is it that human presence live can do, right? And that the human body can do and the human voice can do and a live audience can do that you cannot do in a film, that you cannot. But what's interesting is you use the metaphor of a conductor, that a symphony cannot do, that a painting cannot do, that a ballet cannot do, that a theater is a particular medium, and what can you do in it? And what I was going to say about Matthew Shepard is one thing that struck me the second time that I overlooked the first time because I didn't really know the story. I'm following the story and I'm less focused on the form, is how eminently theatrical it is in the sense that it participates in a kind of collective theatrical unconscious. So there are these key plays about towns, right? Like Our Town, right, is done by every high school, in America or whatever. Or Enemy of the People by Ibsen is the story of a town as much as the people who are in the town, right? And Lope de Vega's Fuente Ovejuna is a revolutionary play about the murder of this corrupt, tax collector, and the town is personified. The Laramie Project, I went, oh yes, right. Laramie is a character in the play. This is an X-ray, a portrait of a town, and that kind of form can only come from having a deep understanding of theater. So again, obviously there were these interviews. There was this kind of basis in reality, but there's always this focus on theatrical form. I know this about Moises' work, and I admire it enormously, is finding the form in which things are told, and each time trying to make it new depending on the material. So in terms of Laramie and what you know about the making of it, especially having these people from the east show up in the west in this little town, it's not like they were like, welcome to Laramie or whatever. They're not happy to have them. How did people talk about how people opened up or talked or whatever in the town?
Well, it's interesting to sort of see the relationship between how they reacted when they made Laramie Project and how they reacted when they made Laramie 10 years later.
Yeah.
I think, if I can remember correctly, I remember company members talking about how people were pretty ready to speak. Yeah, I think it was a tumultuous time in Laramie, and a lot of people wanted to react to give their perspective regardless of which quote-unquote side they stood on. In Laramie 10 years later, there was a lot of pushback. There was actually, I believe, a newspaper article published that was called, the headline was, Laramie is a town, not a project. So people were embarrassed and sort of self-conscious of the reputation that the town had garnered, and were sort of ignoring the heinous, horrific crimes that took place in the town, and ignoring the accountability that must be put on the people existing in that town.
No, it is interesting how that frames it. Jeff, who's Moises' husband, told me that when they went back at some point, and I don't know, at one point in the process, before they had thought, oh, well, there's this whole story or whatever, but as soon as it became to frame it framed the town by being an HBO movie and everything, that they drove up, you know, with something that said the Laramie Project, and said some guy, pardon my French here, but I'm going to say, you know, somebody walking down Main Street in Laramie went, fuck the Laramie Project. This was their welcome to town, right? Was, you know, we've had enough of you guys, go back east, you know, or whatever. So I'm sure there was substantial pushback, and it's fascinating. I know this myself, having grown up in the American South, is that, you know, and it's true, you know, everywhere, that if something that, you know, causes shame to the community, that you don't have a language to talk about it. I'm going to open it up to others. I don't want to, you know, monopolize. I could go on forever, but.
Thank you so much. Sorry, this was very interesting. I have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
It's better without the mic, actually.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So the first one is, could you tell us a little bit how the Laramie Project translated into legislation? So the process in which this happened.
Yeah. Sure.
And then the second question, actually, why don't you start with the first question and then we can.
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. I'm not too sure of much of the details, but as far as I know, the Laramie Project, with the audience that it reached and the way that it brought the conversation to the United States as a whole, legislators sort of, and the way that organizations such as the...
I guess it's that. I'll turn that mic off. Sorry for the feedback. Pardon.
So I think the way that, organizations such as the Matthew Shepard Foundation were formed, there was just, it had become so ingrained in the American culture and so present in the American ear that legislators had to respond to it one way or another. And I will say that before Laramie, Bill Clinton had, he had sponsored an initiative to sign some hate crimes legislation, but none of it covered the expanse that Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. covered. So I do think it's just bringing the story to the people, force politicians to have to act one way or the other.
My second question has to do with, so you all community make a narrative as actors. So what about the staging? What about everything else beyond the narrative itself? So you mentioned that Moises is the director, but does he also include you in decisions about how to use the stage, how to use your voice tone, everything else?
To an extent, yeah. So we all put up the moments, and together, conversations also happen in the moment-making process. You know, it's not all pure synthesis. So we synthesize, we make our moments, but often, yes, the answer is yes to your question. The actors and the designers and the stage managers are in conversation with Moises, or the final decision maker, on what is the form that this play is going to take. You know, like, I think, and often how we speak is through moments, so we're like, you might put up a moment of someone running across the stage if you think at some point you would like to see someone running across the stage. So to an extent, we have a say in that, but at a certain point, the editor joins the room, right? So at a certain point, we don't create outside of hierarchy. You know, there is a hierarchy, and eventually roles are defined. People who want to act go to actors, and in that sense, it's more traditional. In that sense, Moises has the final say, and Moises is telling you where to stand. But you just spend, you know, a year creating moments around the subject matter, so your work will always be there. You know, things will be cut, but the way that our collaboration is always present in the sense that it's ever present, if that makes sense. Thank you for these questions.
We have another question. Sorry about the mic feedback.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
How do you assess the difference in the film and the theater production in terms of its impact on audiences or the public? Is there any way you can assess or compare them?
Sure. So, in general, like I would say, I mean, film reaches people much easier, right? Thank you. But at least in American society, film is more accessible in a lot of ways. You know, with Netflix, with Hulu, you can Google a movie, you know, you don't have to pay anything. Often theater is expensive. And at least in America, we don't view theater as part of our culture as much as, I know like in London, it's like a very ingrained thing in the culture. So I think film reaches audiences more easily, and film is more accessible to people in a way, but I think theater can hit people harder, I believe, because theater is it can resonate with people on a different level, because it's one of the few cultural traditions that we have in which a room of people are experiencing the same thing at the same time, right? It fosters community and storytelling in a way that we've sort of lost in our societies in many ways. I know that I recently was talking to a friend about how I miss, because like at my home, we don't have cable anymore because anything we'd want to watch is on Netflix or whatever. But I miss sort of gathering around with my family to catch the Sunday night episode of, you know, what have you. And even that sort of community has dissipated. So theater sort of maintains that. And I think the other part of your question might be like what can theater do that film cannot? Is that? Yeah. So I think, so while film can capture things realistically and can show us things up close, there's a magic about theater that you can't have in film, right? There's something visceral about a moment in theater that's very sensory in nature, you know, a moment in theater that utilizes lights and music in conversation. It sort of awakens the senses, and it's sort of magical and engaging in a way that I think film can't exactly capture. Does that sort of answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay, and if you want to expand, I'd love
Well,
to.
you said that a group of people in the same room experiencing the same thing.
Right.
What's the difference between that and a group of people at a rock concert or in a movie house?
Sure. So rock concert is harder to answer, but I'll answer movie house. I think the missing link
Let's say somebody, a group of people listening to Joan Baez or Bob
Yeah.
Dylan or something like that with a very political message.
Yeah. Well, I think in that sense, live concerts are theater. They're almost under the same bracket, right? It's live performance. I think with film and seeing a film in the cinema, the missing piece is the engagement between performer and audience, right? There's a transaction there it's just hard to describe, and that sort of fosters community in a way that film doesn't.
Well, as we were talking too, I think the onus in thinking theater, if we can call it that, and it's true of kind of musicians who see themselves as bards in the old-fashioned sense, they engender a kind of intellectual process, and the onus is on the audience to, if you're listening to Bob Dylan songs, this is, I think, what the Nobel Committee was pointing to, is that there is not a prepackaged, definable message, is that you have to decode it, and you end up decoding it in its own way, and it has multiple levels. So it's almost as if theater and or music or performance in which everyone comes together, it's in physical space, and it elicits multiple interpretations, not one easily definable message or the message. And it became clear to me, for example, too, that what theater can particularly do in a traditional society like this is that, for example, whatever it is you can't do, in theater you already have, right? So this is why there's prior censorship. This is why there was in Britain until the mid-60s is, for example, if two men kiss on stage, they did it. You can't do that. They did. It's in the play, right? It happened. You can't say that. They already did, right? So whatever it is you can't do was done. And if I spit on a character in a play, I spat on him, or I have some theatrical version of it. Whereas in a film, you show something. In theater, it happened. And this is part of what makes a live experience radically different. If Bruce Springsteen jumps into the audience, he jumped into the audience, right? you know, he's in physical contact with the audience. And in fact, on Broadway, it's a very interesting and odd thing that they go, under no circumstances must anyone stand up, whatever, be quiet, everybody put your hands in your lap, and, you know, I was born in a small town, you know, and nobody's supposed to, you know, engage in response. So, and theater, if someone slips or falls, or somebody plays a false note, they played it. That's part of the song. That's part of the experience, right?
It happens in real time.
Yeah. So one other question we have? Yes, please.
Not a question. I just
Comment.
Just a comment. Yeah. Yeah, I see it as very different. I mean, music, concert, or a theater. I mean, as you said, the theater provides a different sort of community than a concert.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's because maybe the conversation, it's very different, I think, when, you know, a concert is just there one way, sort of. There's this conversation and this spirit of community, I think, which the theater gives.
Yeah, I think we see ourselves in theater much more than we might in music.
We have one more question, and then I guess we'll...
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Rami had another comment? Yes.
When you interact with audiences in the theater, do you on stage feel it as a two-way interaction?
I do, yeah.
How? What? In which ways?
I think who's a performer in here? Do we have performers in here?
I've done
Yeah, so I feel like everyone gets nervous, right? So part of it, that's a two-way interaction. You know, they are sort of making assessments based on your performance. And for me, I normally expel my nerves by saying, like, them laughing at me when if I do something funny is an interaction. I love when people are at the theater and they verbally explain things, you know, like something happens and they're like, you know, like, I think that's necessary. I'm not really into the Broadway community where, you know, you're just supposed to sit and watch. I think theater is supposed to engage the audience. And often you see, at least in the United States, we have so many more plays that are sort of breaking the fourth wall, right? The like unspoken barrier between audience and actor. I feel like almost most plays, at least like downtown New York plays, are breaking the fourth wall because the audience is there, you know, you can't ignore it. So you might as well embrace it as a form of theater. I'd love to hear from a student.
I saw Christiane Amanpour a couple of weeks ago interviewing Ethan Hawke.
Yeah.
And it was a beautiful interview, and he said that when he was 21 years old, he had his Broadway debut, and he went, I went out on stage and I wasn't nervous at all. He went, I was really stupid. The longer I have worked as an actor, I realized you're nervous. You know, I am nervous. That being, you know, it's fascinating that you say that. It's, you know, there is a frisson, and there should be an emotional frisson there. And the idea that, you know, I just go whatever is to like kind of be frozen inside or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah. I think we could go on a long time, but it's been a lot of fun. I know there'll be people at the workshop, and I wish they were here, but you'll share your wisdom with them. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was
So
great
much
fun.
fun.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I feel like I don't get to have these conversations much since I left school.